In 1961, President Kennedy called on all Americans to rise to the challenges of the day. He knew that success depended upon the unity of efforts throughout the federal government and the nation. In a memorandum he wrote, "I want coordination of government activities outside of Washington significantly strengthened across departments and agency lines." From this, federal executive boards were born. The Greater Boston Federal Executive Board, one of 28 across the country, fosters communication, coordination, and collaboration with federal, state, and local government agencies. It is our hope that through this series, folks will learn about the mission and work done by different agencies, what that means for our country, and more specifically, what that means to each of us as individuals. This is your federal government, and I am your host, Diane LeBlanc. Hello everyone. Today we are featuring the National Park Service, which is part of the Department of Interior. We are most fortunate to have 4 representatives of the National Park Service with us today, each who works for one of our national parks right here in Massachusetts. From the Cape Cod National Seashore, we have Superintendent George Price. From the New Bedford Whaling National Historic Park, we have Superintendent Jen Nersessian. From the Boston National Historic Park, we have Deputy Superintendent Celeste Bernardo. And from the John H. Chaffee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor, we have Executive Director Jan Reitzma. Together, they have 78 years of experience working for the National Park Service. So welcome to each of our guests. And George, I think you have 37 of those 78 years.
That's right, I'm the old guy.
There you go. Well, you're looking good. But I think it is then left to you to give folks the history of the National Park Service. Why do we have national parks?
Well, that's actually an excellent question, especially today when we take a look at our environment and our communities and people are looking for places where they can go outside or they can go and explore their culture. And that was also true in the 19th century, especially during our Industrial Revolution. There were a lot of people that were very concerned about what was actually happening with our great natural resources. And a lot of those people were from Massachusetts, by the way. There were a lot of environmentalists here that really carried the mantle of Thoreau and Emerson and others, and they really treasured the great out of doors, and yet they saw a lot of these areas being eaten up with industry. In the central part of the country, there was this wonderful place that people discovered called Yellowstone, the Yellowstone Valley, and it was not economically viable at the time, so there wasn't too much resistance to set it aside. So there was a movement to actually claim this area as a national preserve of some sort. And they actually declared it as the first national park and pleasuring ground in the world. So this is the first time that really public money set aside property for the enjoyment of all people. It was pretty easy to do that back then too, because it was a federal territory. So all they had to do was really draw a line around the territory and set it aside as the first national park, and that was in 1872. Since that time, the national parks evolved, and we ended up with other great natural wonder areas mostly, and until a couple of Native American sites were brought in. And by 1916, it was determined that really these parks ought to be organized under some more of a formal civilian management. And that's when the National Park Service was actually created in 1916. Guess who was actually in the parks before the National Park Service? Take a look at the uniforms, the hat. It was the Army. So they actually had the military in a lot of the parks, and they were the actual engineers that actually outlined a lot of the roads and did some of the early management. So when the National Park Service was created, we basically kept their uniforms, World War I vintage, and that's why we have the traditional uniform we wear today.
There you go. I've already learned several things.
There you go.
So that's great. And now, Jen, at the outset, I mentioned that the National Park Service is part of the Department of Interior. Just talk a little bit about that, what your relationship is to the Department of Interior.
Sure. The Department of the Interior is sort of our umbrella agency. There are 9 different agencies or bureaus within that, and the Park Service is one of those. Others are the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and collectively we work to conserve our natural resources, to protect public lands, to protect and manage public lands, our energy resources, water resources, as well as fulfill our responsibilities to tribal nations.
So there is a direct relationship, and it makes sense then that you're part of the Department of Interior.
Yes. Ken Salazar, the Secretary of the Interior, is part of the President's Cabinet, and then our Director, John Jarvis, reports directly to him.
Okay. Now, you mentioned Yellowstone, and how many parks do we have nationwide, and how many do we have here in Massachusetts?
We have 397 across the country, different kinds of national park units. Right here in Massachusetts, we've got 15 national parks and another 5 national heritage areas.
Excellent. Now, what are the most popular sites in the country? I'm guessing Yellowstone. Is that the number one?
Well, it depends on what you mean by popular. Obviously, people...
Visitorship.
Well, believe it or not, Cape Cod National Seashore is in the top 10.
Excellent.
We get between 4 and 5 million visits a year, but some parks really top that quite a bit. But we get a lot of visitation in national parks. It really is quite the important place to go for a lot of citizens.
So Cape Cod within the top 10.
Right.
Would you know exactly where? We're in the top 10.
Depending on the year, we come in at 7, 8, or 9.
Excellent. Now, how about some of those that are in the top 5?
It depends on if you want to look at traditional national parks, of which we have about 70 in the country. Usually the ones that come to mind are Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Great Smokies. Those usually juggle around in the top 3 or so. But if you look at the other kind of units that the National Park Service manages, those traditional parks are a small part of that. You know, everything from national seashores to national recreation areas to national historical parks. You're looking at places like Cape Cod, Golden Gate National Recreation Area out in San Francisco, the Statue of Liberty, Blue Ridge Parkway, places like that see the most visitors.
And all the monuments down on the Mall in D.C. Park Service manages that as well.
But our locations here in Massachusetts are part of that broader family. Absolutely. And those big names that everybody does recognize. So Celeste, talk a little bit about the resources that our Massachusetts national parks protect.
Right, and we've been talking a lot about natural parks, and of course the National Park Service also preserves cultural sites, and you can't talk about American history and not talk about Massachusetts. So we're really blessed with a whole variety of sites here that really take us through our American history, from the American Revolution, where you have sites like in Boston, Lexington and Concord, you have Minuteman, the Adams House down in Quincy. We have sites that deal with the Industrial Revolution, like Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. We also have Lowell National Historical Park, maritime history up in Salem or down in New Bedford, a whole variety of sites that are throughout the country. We also, throughout the state. We also have, of course, our national treasure of the National Seashore at Cape Cod that people really enjoy. So there's a really wonderful variety and number within the state itself.
So almost 400 parks across the country, and the 15 plus in Massachusetts, that has to have a tremendous impact on the economy. Jen, talk a little bit about that.
Well, it has a huge impact. And just here in Massachusetts, the economic impact of our national parks was over $440 million in 2010.
Wow.
It's huge. You know, everything from the direct spending of the visitors that come here, plus the jobs they support, the hotel operators, the taxi drivers, the restaurants and concession operators. It has a really widespread economic impact.
Now, in addition to the responsibility for managing the parks and these wonderful resources, the National Park Service also administers various grant programs that have a tremendous impact on communities across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Sure. We're not just national parks. We're involved in local communities in all kinds of ways, from programs like the Rivers and Trails Conservation Assistance Program and the Land and Water Conservation Funds, where we're on the ground in communities doing things like trail planning, open space planning, development of local parks, initiatives like that that really connect people to the land, to the resources, and to each other. We manage the Historic Tax Credits Program. I mean, that just in Massachusetts, since it began in 1995, we've seen over $2 billion of private investment that's incentivized in historic preservation. We manage with the National Historic Landmarks Program. We're the keepers of the National Register. I mean, again, in Massachusetts, there's over 4,000 properties on the National Register. So, you know, we're one of those densely historic areas, and the Park Service is involved in communities all over the state, far beyond just these 20, areas that we manage.
Anybody else want to add anything to that point?
Just a little bit more about the economic impact. I think it may be important to note that apart from the direct impact from visitors coming to the parks, there's also the impact of parks and national heritage areas on the surrounding area. A lot of national heritage areas actually got started in areas that have been economically depressed. And part of the effect has been to revitalize those regions and communities. And that's not only national heritage areas. If you look at Lowell, for example, the effect the national park has had on the revitalization of that community, it's tremendous. And part of that is really working as partnerships. So in Lowell, the partnership between the park and the university, for example, and other partners. And both in the heritage areas and the parks, as working closely with the states as well as the municipalities to get programs done. Natural resources restored, cultural resources restored and protected. That has a tremendous indirect impact on the economy.
Of course. Now, I'm going to give each of you an opportunity to highlight your particular site and talk about the activities that go on there and what folks have available to them. But George, there's a lot of sites that aren't represented at the table here today. So talk a little bit about some of the activities that folks would be able to participate in if they went to some of those other sites.
Sure. I'll mention, of course, the Lowell Folk Festival. I worked in Lowell for many years, and that's I call it a once-in-a-lifetime activity that happens every year in downtown Lowell. It's the last full weekend in July. And that was an opportunity to collaborate with the Council for Traditional Arts and actually put on a festival that really celebrates the ethnicity in Lowell. There's about 50 different ethnic groups that had to do with the Industrial Revolution in Lowell. So, and the other thing about the Lowell legislation, it's really written in present tense terms. It's not just they were here once upon a time, but a lot of those ethnic groups are still there. So that is just a fabulous activity, but you'll see many, many activities. They'll have waterfront festivals, of course, down in Boston. They have other activities along the Blackstone. And there'll be, I know you've got something with the National Council too down in downtown New Bedford. So actually coming out and being part of a celebration is a great way to explore some of our national park units.
And even though you are the federal government, again, you are based in communities, and I know that the National Park Service just places so much emphasis on those relationships, building those relationships and working within the local communities, and that really helps to define a lot of your local programming.
It does, and I think one of the things about Massachusetts, it really represents transition in national parks. So I referred to Yellowstone being created totally out of federal land, and places like the Grand Canyon and other places were the same way. Here in Massachusetts, even with the first unit that was established, and that would be up in Salem, they were already in an urban area. And here you have some parks that are more traditional and some that are just totally partnership. Certainly Boston National Historical Park is a very early partnership park with the Freedom Trail in the city of Boston. We just celebrated our 50th anniversary at Cape Cod National Seashore. President Kennedy signed it into legislation, and the 44,000 acres really spans 6 different towns. So even though there's Park Service land, there's a lot of boundary that is actually owned either by private property or by the towns. Then you get up to Lowell, where we're in the middle of the city, or New Bedford in the middle of the city, and then the Boston Harbor Islands, which basically the federal government owns very little property. It's mostly all the partners out there.
So I'm gonna look to Celeste or to Jan, whoever wants to take this question. Is there anything that all parks have in common?
Fun.
Fun. Good answer. Good answer.
And let me elaborate on that a little bit. I think what is common to the national parks is that you can experience more than just one thing. You may think that you're going there to experience history or learn about history, but you find out that there's actually a lot to do in that area. A lot of our units and heritage areas offer the diversity. You know, in the Blackstone, for example, you can literally travel through history, focus on history, but you can do it while you're on the bikeway or while you're on the river paddling. So there's that nice combination of recreation and natural resources and history that basically is offered in almost every park.
So most sites, do they offer both an indoor and outdoor component?
I would say so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, in most cases. And that's, I think, can be important too when you think about, you know, what's the traditional audience for national parks and what are we trying to do with reaching new audiences. And when you think about families and teenagers, and you know, they may be interested in certain things a little bit less than others, but when you have the diversity, it becomes, you know, an experience that all of them enjoy.
Of course. Now, are certain parks only opened during particular seasons, or is every park open all year long? How does that work in Massachusetts?
Well, it depends on the site. Adams, for instance, is closed during the winter time, the home of presidents, but they have a season. You'd be able to find that on the website. Other parks, for instance, at the Seashore, our visitor center is open year-round, and obviously all the trails are, but some of the other programs and everything fold down, whereas places like the Boston sites are generally open in New Bedford Visitor Center, so it depends on the site.
Are there some sites in Massachusetts that are more appropriate for different constituency groups, such as you mentioned families, Jan? Any sites particularly family-friendly, or are they all family-friendly?
I think they're all family-friendly, and it depends on what you're going there for. And we certainly encourage families, and not just families, but we encourage people even without a family per se to bring a young person to a park. There's a fellow named Richard Louv that's written a couple of books on getting kids outside. You know, he wrote The Last Child in the Woods, and I'm a big fan of his. And there's nothing more important to a child than when an adult they really respect takes them on a trip someplace. And going and out and exploring. I encourage people to be their own park ranger and pick a park. For Pete's sakes, most of the parks we're talking about are in very easy commuting distance to see here in Massachusetts, and I would suggest people do that. The other thing that I would mention that touches me is that parks aren't just for a casual visit. The stories of these parks are really emotionally packed. When I worked at Minuteman National Park, we would have people come to the statue and they would literally have tears in their eyes because it was a pilgrimage. Places at the Cape, Fort Hill, for instance, are almost sacred ground. When I walk around downtown New Bedford and I think about the whaling, and you go into the chapel and you see the dedication to all the people that died in the whaling industry. I mean, this is real stuff. This isn't just make-believe. You take a look where the Tea Party took place, or you take a look at where the plantation industry took place down along the Blackstone. I mean, it really can get you
Very
going.
emotional.
And if you're a parent, or if you're an uncle or an aunt or a neighbor, and you go out on one of these field trips, you have a lot to explore.
So what about the costs associated with visiting a national park, Celeste? Are any of them free, or is there always a fee?
There are some sites that are free that you can come to. At Boston, for example, in the Charlestown Navy Yard, all of the sites are free there. You can visit the Constitution Museum, go on a World War II destroyer. There are other sites that have admission fees, but it's a pretty nominal fee for sites, so it
Do you
varies.
need to make a reservation?
Reservations, for the most part, people can just go and visit. If you're coming with a group, they typically suggest that you make a reservation in advance to accommodate that group.
And I believe at the Adams House, you probably have to make a reservation to get to the tour bus to go through the tour.
Jan, any tips for folks who are interested in visiting a national park here in Massachusetts? What should they do to prepare themselves to make the most of their experience?
Well, I don't want to make it sound too much like a big enterprise, but on the other hand, I think it's good to read up a little bit. These days we make it pretty easy with our websites. Just people can go to www.nps.gov and then / and then pick the park, where there is a drop-down menu where people can find a park. And there's a lot of information there about what that park stands for, the stories that it tells, the resources that are there, the kinds of programs that are being offered. So it's a good way to prepare a little bit, and you can get a sense and maybe make a choice as to the kinds of experience that you're going to have.
And it's a great website. I went to it and played around with it in preparation for our talk today. And I'm going to look at my notes so I don't get this wrong, but I was astounded. The number of volunteer hours that are donated to the National Park Service and the American people nationwide, 97,417,260 hours. That's the equivalent of over 95,000 full-time employees. I was shocked when I saw that statistic, considering that there are only 28,000 paid employees who work for the National I was going to say the National Archives, my agency, but the National Park Service, and that many of them are only temporary. Those aren't even full-time employees. So you've obviously got a great thing, and people want to be part of that, and how fortunate for the American people to have that tremendous cost savings. But Jen, tell us, what do volunteers who work for the Park Service do?
They do all kinds of things. Anything there's paid employees doing, you can find volunteers doing, that many more types of things. Anything from giving tours to working a visitor center desk to doing database entry or working maintenance on a trail, fixing signs, working with the public, working behind the scenes. We wouldn't be able to function without them.
And how does somebody become a volunteer?
Go to your nearest national park, whichever one interests you the most, and just introduce yourself and tell them you're interested. And any of us would be happy to sign you up.
Excellent, excellent. All right, we're going to give
On that, I just want to point something out, that both with volunteers and with partnerships, what it means among many things is that, for example, everybody seems to really like to work with national parks and National Park Service people. But the other thing is that really the volunteers and the partners help us protect the resources, and that you get this local stewardship that increasingly has become important for the National Park Service, and that we don't just rely on the people working for the Park Service, but we rely on people in the communities who care about these stories and the resources to be part of the protection.
Talk a little bit about your location. Tell people why they should come visit, and if they do make a visit, what can they do?
Okay. Well, the Blackstone Valley is it's a watershed. It runs from Providence, Rhode Island, all the way into Worcester. And by the way, 4 out of the 5 National Heritage Areas in Massachusetts are by state. So they're either in Connecticut and Massachusetts, or Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Blackstone is in Massachusetts and Rhode Island. If you start in Providence or in Pawtucket, you can literally start with the beginning of the American Industrial Revolution at Slater Mill. You can get an indoor tour of how that got started and how that was the beginning of a kind of industrial development called the Rhode Island model of manufacture that developed with mill villages spreading throughout the valley. You can make your way upstream, literally, and see the mill villages as they began to spread out from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, into the valley and going north. And then different themes developing, such as technological innovation, for example. So what you can do is visit these museums. Slater Mill is a National Historic Landmark, get ranger tours, or you can do self-guided tours. You can go on the bikeway, which leads you through a lot of these resource areas, or you can do paddling, because part of our story has been the restoration of the Blackstone River. One of the legacies of the Industrial Revolution was a lot of pollution. And so the cleanup of that has become part of our story, and now the recreational use of that river is a big part of our asset. So through the valley, you can visit all these different mill villages, each with their own story and part of the aspect of how industrialization evolved in the country. but then you can also enjoy the natural resources and meet with a lot of, in our case, a lot of partner sites that operate different historic sites throughout the valley. A lot of educational programs, a lot of recreational programs.
So you mentioned educational programs. You offer opportunities for teachers to bring their students, field trips?
Absolutely. We have a huge number of school groups going, for example, to Slater Mill, but also the Museum of Work and Culture in Woonsocket, which focuses on, and this is the other thing I wanted to mention, that a lot of our stories are about people. In the Blackstone Valley, a lot of immigration stories, the French Canadians, for example, and also the labor part of the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of school groups visiting these facilities, and we work together with the partners who own and operate those facilities to offer educational programs.
Great. Celeste, how about at your site? What would folks do if they came there?
Well, we actually have two sites that are right in downtown Boston, and we're connected now by a common visitor center, the Faneuil Hall Visitor Center. The Visitor Center will connect these two very important trails, the Freedom Trail and the Black Heritage Trail. And we like to call it the Trails to Freedom, because really starting with the American Revolution, which of course most people know the Freedom Trail, there are certain sites along there that are part of Boston National Historical Park. Many of them are our partners, so you can visit the Old South Meeting House, Paul Revere House, the Old State House, the Old North Church, and continue on to the Park Service sites like Bunker Hill Monument or the Charlestown Navy Yard. On the other side, the Black Heritage Trail, you can leave the Revolution and go on into the 19th century and learn about the free black community in Beacon Hill that really fought against slavery. You can learn about the Underground Railroad and what was going on in Boston in the 19th century to end the institution of slavery. So it's a fabulous, the African Meeting House, which has been restored and open, and it's just fabulous to visit the Abel Smith School and different sites along the trail. So there are rangers who do tours of those trails. We have a new iPad application that people can download on the website or go to iTunes. They can download it right at the Faneuil Hall Visitor Center. They can go and kind of devise their own tours if they want and find out information. So there's lots of things to do on that. And then each of the sites themselves have their own experience that you can go inside the sites and really experience the real places, which is just terrific. We have school programs, we have curriculum, training for teachers, a whole variety of experiences for folks.
And again, for folks who are interested, or teachers, for example, in bringing their students, what's that process?
They should go to the website, and there's information. Each of our sites, if you go to that www.nps.gov, you can select the parks by state or by topics. Each of our sites have information for teachers that they can specifically go to. Some of it has curriculum that you can download, free curriculum, or else there's information that they can tap right into and talk to folks about coming and bringing their classes.
And how about visitorship for the Boston parks? Any idea what the annual visitorship is?
About 3.5 million.
Wow.
And we're thinking with the Faneuil Hall Visitor Center, it's probably going to be going up.
Excellent, excellent. Jen?
Down at New Bedford, we commemorate the history of whaling and how that shaped our history as a country and our national identity. Back in the 1800s, New Bedford was the wealthiest city in the country at one point and one of the wealthiest cities in the world. And really the energy driver of our country as people went out and hunted whales and brought the whale oil back to fuel lights and the birth of a nation. We also talk about related stories. It's a really rich history. I think of New Bedford as the first truly globalized city in the United States because whaling brought people there from all over the world. They'd get on a ship, come here, and sometimes stay. And a lot of the communities that came here because of the whaling industry that established themselves in New Bedford at that point still are there today and have really grown and prospered, from the local Cape Verdean community to the Azorean community, our African American community. And there are all kinds of festivals that go on throughout the year, a lot of cultural festivals and events that really commemorate that. We have music every Thursday night, every summer. The second Thursday of every month, we have AHA, our Art, History, and Architecture Night, where all the businesses open up, all the stops are open late, and people can come and really get some unique programming and events that showcase our city. New Bedford, as a result of the whaling industry, became a very important stop on the Underground Railroad. because there were a lot of free African Americans there, because there was a large Quaker population who had a really tolerant attitude towards different cultures and identities and had fought against slavery, because it was a convenient place. There was money, jobs, and if you needed to get lost on a whaling ship for a couple of years, you could do that. A lot of people came to New Bedford, a lot of people escaping slavery from the South. This summer, we'll have, for the first time open to the public, the Nathan and Polly Johnson House, which was Frederick Douglass's first free home. So that was a very important part of our national history in the abolishment of slavery. Other things to do, Summerfest, every year around 4th of July weekend, there's a huge folk festival and crafts festival, and the city lights up. The last weekend in September every year, we have the Working Waterfront Festival. And I should say, you know, with all of these sites, the history of these sites, it's not something that happened in the past and we have to go learn about it like a school lesson. It's happening today, and you see it in all the sites today and all these cities today, you know, how it shaped who these cities are now. I mean, for instance, in New Bedford, the whaling industry, you know, is the direct antecedent of the working waterfront of today. New Bedford is still the top dollar catch port in the country. We have a very active seaport with ships coming in and out. Scallops is a major industry there. And so at the end of September every year, we have a festival to celebrate that and share some of that lifestyle and culture of the maritime industry with the public.
So it sounds like there's always something different going on, even if you visited a number of years ago, even if you visited last month.
Yes.
It's a good thing to come back.
Absolutely. And you know, New Bedford is also one of those partnership parks. You know, we have the Park Service there, but we work with many entities throughout the city, from the Whaling Museum to the Seaman's Bethel, the chapel that I think George mentioned before, where Herman Melville came and was inspired, you know, for some of Moby Dick. Many partners throughout the city.
Excellent. George, we've got a little bit of time left.
Sure.
Tell us about your site.
Well, we're kind of the token natural place, you know. Basically, unlike a particular story, the initiative to preserve the National Seashore area had to do with the environment, and that was to protect the great beach that Henry David Thoreau spoke about in the 19th century. And the National Seashore was actually looked at in the 1930s to be set aside because people were concerned about the great beaches that still were active on the East Coast that had not yet been commercialized. For instance, the Jersey Shore, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, or even up here, Revere Beach. So they were looking at how could we actually preserve it. It didn't happen in the 1930s, it happened in 1961. And people are really glad that it took place. So 44,000 acres, 6 lifeguarded beaches,
wow.
20-some miles of roads and trails, all kinds of things to do, from hiking to biking to swimming to kayaking, you name it, we've got it. So we're preserving the environment on the one hand, and we're having it access to recreational uses on the other, and it really is very exciting. Plus, we're also partnering with the towns, and when you visit, certainly a visit to the Cape, you have to drop in on Chatham, or you have to drop in on Provincetown as part of the experience as well.
That is very exciting, and you know, we are in a tough economy, and people are always looking for things to do that are close, and you've all talked about so much that's available to people who live in Massachusetts, right here in Massachusetts, that I think we don't often think about. I was going to ask what a typical day is like in the life of a superintendent, but you all manage such varied properties and resources. I'm guessing that each one of you would have a different answer to that. So I'm going to go to you, Celeste. What's a typical day like for you?
Well, in my day, I'm actually a deputy superintendent, so I work for the superintendent, but most of my day is spent focusing on things that relate to either the resources of the park or the visitor's experience and making it a wonderful thing. So whether it's our law enforcement rangers or our cultural resources that manage everything in the park, our interpreters who are out there talking to the public and managing the visitor centers, maintenance who's just taking care of all of those sites. That's the sort of thing I'm engaged in all day long.
So Jan, what haven't I asked that you think people need to know?
Let me think. The one thing I wanted to mention that we haven't talked about is how the park experience relates directly to public health, and how increasingly in the federal government, more than one agency is talking about the importance of getting people outdoors, and kids in particular. And that's an important part of what we do as well, because we get our leadership saying, how important it is, and how they want all of our parks as well as other agencies to work on that. And so we're looking for opportunities to do that, and work again with our partners, in particular the states and the local governments, but also the school districts, to do that kind of activity, develop new programs so that we get the children and the students outdoors. And that is a huge potential, really, that still can be realized with
very, very important.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to add?
I think the biggest thing is that these places belong to all of us.
Yes.
I mean, this is part of all of our heritage, and these places belong to you. And come on out and explore, have a good time, recreate, be a ranger, take your friends and relatives around and see what's out there.
Now, if somebody wants to learn more about the National Park Service or a particular property, a particular park site, what should they do?
First stop is our website, www.nps.gov. For any one of our parks, if you want to learn more about the individual park or help plan your visit, you can write to us. You can call our visitor centers on the phone. Just stop by and chat up a ranger, and we're always happy to talk.
Excellent. This has been great. We are out of time. I want to thank our guests from the National Park Service for joining us, for helping us to better understand the work that they do to preserve and make available our nation's historic, natural, and cultural resources for all to enjoy. These are your national parks, and I encourage you to visit the 15 parks right here in Massachusetts often. I thank you for watching, and I hope that you will continue to join us as we feature other federal agencies on your federal government.